Hello, everybody. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Please let me know as we go throughout the stream today if you can hear me and if you can see everything okay. Since last time we hung out on live stream, I had a pretty major computer repair that I had to do, including a new hard drive. So I had to re-download all of my programs and things and make sure everything is working. So OBS Studio, which is what I used to stream when I re-downloaded it, somehow miraculously remembered all of my slides and things. So I think everything should be good. But on the off chance that it's not, if you can't see any graphics, if we have any, connectivity issues, if I have any mic issues, please just let me know. So yeah, we'll get started in a little bit. I hope everybody has been doing well since last we talked. Hi, Don't Feed the Bears. It's good to see you. Yeah, computers and technology and everything, they can be quite a pain. But uh, I was pretty lucky overall, so I can't complain too much. But I hope you've been doing well. Thanks for being here. And I'm glad that everything is good. I'm gonna just jump back to the no audio screen for just a minute because I want to adjust my microphone and I don't want to make a whole bunch of noise when I do that. So I'll be right back. All right, there we go. That's better. That's much closer to me now. Koya Multiverse. I love that username. That is terrific. Hi there. Thank you for being here today. I hope you're doing well. I figure I'll give everybody a couple minutes to come on in since technically my start time is noon, but I wanted to get the stream up and running a few minutes early because like I said all of those different computer issues, I wanted to give myself a little time in case I needed to adjust anything. But otherwise, we'll just kind of hang out. We'll wait here for a few minutes and see who else comes in to join us today for book club. Hi there, Metaloop. It's good to see you. How have you been? Don't Feed the Bears? Yeah, I actually. So the funny thing is, I never read The Little Prince before. Like, I know a lot of people grew up with the story, and so it's been something that's like followed them their whole lives. But you know, even though I knew of the story, I had never really been like exposed to it super much until I became Army, and so reading it and kind of getting the emotions now was a really interesting experience for me. And thinking about it through like an army context and a BTS context made me even extra emotional. It really is such a beautiful in-depth story, and I so enjoyed reading it both from the the army and BTS analysis context and just like the context of reading like this beautiful classic. Yeah, it made me really emotional too. All right. So while we wait to get started and, see who else joins us, I'm just going to get through my housekeeping really quick. I'm sure all of you could see from the stream title and the thumbnail and everything. Today is Book Club for the Little Prince. So I'm really excited to get into everything. I took a whole bunch of notes, so we have a lot to discuss. So let me just blast through my housekeeping real quick. Nothing too major. Oh, that's okay, Metaloop. Yeah, no problem. I always like summarize and things too. So you can kind of listen to the summary, and I thank you for also kind of sharing that little blurb. I would love to read into that. I always, this is such an interesting story experience for me. So I really have like been enjoying diving deeper. So yeah, I will gladly take anything that you all might have found during like your research and the process too, because this is such an interesting piece that I had never experienced before. So just to get through my housekeeping really quickly, I do have a live stream schedule change to let you guys know about. Originally, I was thinking of doing a live stream on the 19th of July, and that was just going to be like a casual chatting live stream. And I'm going to have to push that back a little bit because I did not realize, but that is the day that we take inventory at my job. So it's all hands on deck, so everything can, count and we can count everything and organize everything and then continue to open for business for the day. So I will let you know on when the new date is going to be because I don't know what my like work schedule looks like beyond that. So I will keep you all posted on that, but no longer 7/19 for that one. So, but otherwise, we can go ahead and jump right in to everything we want to discuss today for The Little Prince. So, of course, The Little Prince most predominantly shows up with a lot of visual themes and symbols in Jin's Map of the Soul 7 Solo Song Moon, but I think it has a lot of different relevant things that we could talk about, so I think it's going to be a really good discussion today. Don't feel this. Yeah, you get me. Inventory, the joys of inventory. The only good thing about inventory day is because I'm not a morning person and everybody at my job knows that. So inventory usually tends to be done really early in the morning and then we open up for business. So all the people who did inventory leave and then those of us who are actually running the business for the day come in. So luckily I'm just coming in for a regular shift and not actually the inventory part because they looked at me and they're like, you would not be able to live if you came in at 6 a.m. I'm like, this is correct. Thank you for acknowledging it. Hello, Sonia. It's good to see you. I'm glad you could be here. Yes, I've been very excited to do this, and I've been prepping for this. I took so many notes for this. I took like 10 pages of notes, so I'm really excited to unpack some things. I'm super excited to hear everybody else's thoughts and interpretations. Yeah, so let's get into it. And for anybody who maybe has to leave early or anything like that, as always, this will be up on the channel so you can catch up on what you missed. And I always love getting comments there too, so feel free to leave me a comment. So I'm gonna jump into the plot summary. For those of you who maybe haven't read it in a while or didn't get a chance. So the story of the Little Prince follows the adventures of an unnamed narrator. He details how he was an imaginative child whom no one understood and eventually grows up to become a pilot. He comes to accept that very few adults understand his whimsy. In fact, a lot of them kind of discourage it when the story begins with him wanting to be an artist, trying to show them different art, and they say maybe you should just focus on other things instead. So one day, the narrator crash lands in the desert, where he encounters a strange boy whom he dubs the Little Prince. Shockingly, the Little Prince understands things that no adult ever has, and he says he comes from another planet. He slowly starts telling the narrator more and more of his story, which includes little details about how he has to defend his planet from bad seeds that could grow into massive trees. And then he also tells about how he lovingly tended to another seed which grew into this rose, who is beautiful but ultimately very vain. So eventually the prince decides to leave his home planet, which is a tiny little asteroid, so that he can explore more of the galaxy. And he explored several other planets before eventually making his way to Earth, where he landed in the same desert that the narrator is in, just before him. So in the desert, the prince meets a snake, but no people, and reflects on how lonely he is. Um, I just realized I made a typo there. Later, he sees more roses that are like his rose back home, and he thought that his rose was the only one in the galaxy. So, seeing all these other roses on Earth really challenges his perception that his rose was unique, which makes him really sad. But then eventually, he encounters a fox who tells him about being tamed. And the fox describes being tamed as having ties to someone or something, which will make it special to you. And through this, the prince comes to understand his rose was unique after all because of how much they mattered to each other and all the time and care that he spent with her, and learns basically the core lesson at the heart of the story, which is that important things are not visible to the eye. So then the story kind of takes a brief interlude to go through the prince's whole history like that. And then it jumps back into the story that the narrator is telling of saying, trying to fix his plane and get out of the desert. So eventually, after a lot of hardship and a lot of worry, he is able to fix the plane. But he finds the little prince talking to the same snake from before. And the prince is asking the snake to, quote, send him back home. So he tells the narrator not to be sad or to think he has died, even though it may look that way, and says to think of him whenever he sees the stars. So the prince allows the snake to bite him, but the next day the narrator can't find a body or any trace of the little prince anywhere. So the story ends with the narrator asking us as the readers to let him know if we ever see the little prince in the desert like he did. So like Sonia said, short but sweet. It's there's so much in it. There's so much depth. There's so much to analyze. There's so much heart, like we were saying before. It's surprisingly very emotional. You wouldn't expect, because The Little Prince was kind of, I feel like it's one of those books that has appeal to everybody across all ages, but it is very much written almost like a kind of childlike fable. And then so for it to have such an emotional core component and like have such an emotional kind of, sad, bittersweet ending, it really takes it into this whole other realm of not just being like, like a cutesy little fable, and it turns it into this incredibly rich work that has so much to draw from, and it's really amazing how much can be packed into that. And I should say as well, just to give proper credit, The Little Prince is a novella written by a French author and aviator, which you can kind of see in the narrator being a pilot named Antoine de Saint-Exupery. And I apologize for my terrible American accent on that French pronunciation, but definitely wanted to shout out the writer because his work here is absolutely amazing and very, very lovingly crafted. So, the big question in any book club is, of course, why are we talking about this particular story? And in the instance of The Little Prince, one of the biggest relevance that we'll see to BTS's work is in Jin's solo song Moon from Map of the Soul 7. You can see it particularly in the online concert Map of the Soul 1 or on E. And so those visual symbols are scattered throughout Jin's performance. We can see the prince's rose, the narrator's airplane. All of the dancers were in masks to look like foxes, which kind of represents the fox that the little prince meets. And there's a lot more. If you, just watch that performance of Moon, you'll pick up more. But those are some of the biggest ones. And there's a lot that I believe in Moon kind of points to the themes of the Little Prince, even beyond just the visuals. So lyrically, the song Moon is about Jin's love for Army. He calls himself the moon and says that he orbits around Earth, which is Army, and admires the beauty of Army and wants to, work hard and make all these sacrifices for Army. And I think in some ways you could say that the love and devotion that the little prince shows his rose is kind of mirrored in the love and devotion that Jin shows Army. And I'm not saying, because the rose in the book is very vain, and I'm definitely not saying that like Jin is calling us vain or anything, but I think it's more just that idea of connection, and the idea of having to, kind of leave things behind, but learning that they matter. I think that's all very very important. And I think a lot of the themes of the book, like seeing things with your heart and like having responsibility for the things you love, the things that you're connected to, I think those are all very much present in Moon. And I also think they're present in The Astronaut, which we'll also talk about in a second. Obviously, Moon is the most obvious reference to The Little Prince, especially the live performance. But I think we do see a lot of the same themes in The Astronaut and in some of other BTS work as well. So there's actually a lot to unpack with The Little Prince because it's a lot more involved in BTS's work than you would think. All right, so The Astronaut. It's so funny because, you know, getting ready to talk about The Little Prince, I was obviously thinking of Moon and a couple other BTS references that I knew, but as I was reading The Little Prince, it was really reminding me of The Astronaut as well. So, even though all of those Little Prince references were put in earlier, I definitely think that we could talk about The Astronaut too. Javine, hello. I was thinking about you. No worries about being late. I know you've been traveling and doing all sorts of stuff, but I hope you had a great time. How was everything? Yeah, Sonia, I was really struck by connection being such a big theme of the Little Prince, and something that I found really interesting while I was researching was, and we'll be talking about it a lot as we go through the themes of the story. But something that I found interesting is when you read an English translation of The Little Prince, it's always talking about the act of being tamed. Which, you know, kind of makes sense when the prince is talking to the fox, of course, because it's, you know, it almost feels like, you know, tame the fox and make it like a pet. But it has, you know, in English, the word tamed has like a strange connotation if you're trying to like put it into a different context outside of just talking about like, you know, you tamed like a wild animal. Um, and it's interesting. I found that apparently in the original French for The Little Prince, the word that is used that is being translated as tamed actually has like a different meaning. Like it actually is a more like loving and reciprocal connection. So I think that's really interesting that literally baked into, you know, the core idea of the Little Prince and everything at the heart of the story is literally the idea of having like a loving connection. Hello, Hitchhiker Hobbit. Good to see you. No problem at all. I figured you were probably still commuting, so but I'm glad you could be here. And I'm really looking forward to talking with everybody today, so I'm glad you could be here too. So as far as the astronaut goes, I there was especially later in the story, a lot of the plot points of the Little Prince really were pinging me back to the video for the astronaut. So the video of the astronaut, of course, portrays Jin as the astronaut who wanders the galaxy until he finds himself stranded on Earth after crash landing. Excuse me. And he is forced to wait for the day when his spaceship will be ready to fly again. And during that time, he settles into like a typical suburban neighborhood where he befriends a little girl. And when the time comes for him to leave, he thinks of the special time he spent with his friend and makes the choice to let the spaceship leave without him and chooses to remain on Earth. Now, obviously, in The Little Prince, he doesn't choose to remain on Earth. He doesn't choose to remain with like the narrator or anything. But I do still think the idea of connection and, you know, wanting to be with the person who matters and understands you is very much present in The Little Prince. Like both the song and the video are about connection, and like Jin is ignored by everybody except the little girl who's like the only one who understands him, which really kind of reminds me of the way the Little Prince and the narrator relate to each other. There's also a part in The Little Prince where the prince notes that only the children know what they're looking for, which really reminds me of the little girl in The Astronaut as well. You know, she seems to be the only one who really understands Jin's astronaut character and you know, cares enough to connect with him. So it really reminded me of a lot of those themes of The Little Prince, of like life and, you know, innocence and things like that. Javid, I'm so glad you had a good time. That makes me so happy. I was just saying earlier that I had to push back my live stream in July a little bit, unfortunately, but I'm really looking forward to being able to have a big detailed conversation with you all about your concert experiences, because that's what I want to do in that July live stream is just, you know, we can chat about, you know, how you all found the concerts and everything. So I'm really excited for that, and I hope eventually you can sleep. I know what you mean. It's a lot when you're concerting. I think when I got back from Jin's concerts, because I did both days and I was traveling and everything, when I got back home, I basically just like passed out and slept for like 10 hours. And yes, I like that comment, Sonia, about the taming theme in The Little Prince, about it takes patience in building connection, and I think that's, a very interesting way of describing it, of just like, you know, and the whole section where the fox talks to the little prince just really was like a very emotional section, and just like so beautifully written, and that idea of, you know, the fox tells the little prince there's 100,000 foxes, there's 100,000 little boys, but if we are connected to each other, then you're the only person and I'm the only fox, and that we'll be the only ones that are special to each other. And that's such a beautiful way of phrasing it. So, like I said before, a lot of this analysis is obviously going to center really heavily on Moon, and a little bit on the astronaut, but there are a lot of other ways that the Little Prince shows up in BTS's work, both thematically and just like very obviously. So, for me, one of the big things that jumped out to me when reading The Little Prince was the fact that pretty much all of the story takes place in the desert, and we know that the desert is super central to a lot of BTS's work, and it's often depicted as representing hardship or a difficult journey. We hear it in a song like Make It Right. We hear it in a song like See. We see it visually in certain music videos. So in the book, the fact that the little prince and the narrator are stranded in the desert kind of, I think, has some of that same energy and same symbolism. And something that's really interesting, a lot of times in BTS's work, they contrast the desert with the sea. And even though there's no ocean in The Little Prince, there is water. One of the scenes in the book, the little prince says the desert is beautiful because it contains a well somewhere. So it's kind of that water theme again, which is really, really interesting. And then the other one, it's kind of minor in The Little Prince. The rose mentions her thorns, and it's something that the Little Prince thinks about, of like, why do flowers have thorns? And the thorns for me, whenever I think about, thorns and BTS's work, I immediately jump to On, because thorns are so visually shown in the On music video and on all of their performances. It's also really interesting because both a rose and thorns are also referenced in Inner Child, V's solo song off of the same album. It's kind of more literal, like he's describing like a rose blooming among the thorns to like be like looking back on your hardships and seeing them as beautiful. So it's not necessarily like as overtly symbolic as the one in On, but it's still kind of symbolic. And then thorns and street lamps and street lights, or I should maybe say instead like more of a lamp that you would light, like a gas lamp. That's gonna be a symbol that we'll actually talk about on the next slide. And that's, kind of an important part of The Little Prince. And talking about street lamps and thorns is something that Namjoon does in Moonchild, where he talks about seeing somebody else's thorns is comforting. But probably the most notable one that I can pick out is from another one of Namjoon's songs, Bicycle, in which he has a lyric that says, "Things that are truly precious can't be seen by the eye," which is almost word for word the quote from The Little Prince about like the important central lesson that the fox teaches the Little Prince. So it jumps out right away. And then, of course, the last reference that really jumps out at me that really speaks to BTS and their work is the stars. They talk about the stars a lot in The Little Prince because the Little Prince comes from space, and tells the narrator to think of him when he looks at the stars. And I think a lot, Microcosmos is a great example, another song off of Map of the Soul, but there's a lot of instances of talking about stars throughout BTS's work. So a lot of things that are relevant to The Little Prince that I think really echo throughout BTS's other work as well. I think you can really see how the ideas of the story speak to them and probably are things that they think about when they have these conversations. Oh yeah, Hitchhiker Hobbit, no problem. No problem at all. It'll be really interesting to see like what themes specifically jumped out at me versus what themes maybe jumped out at all of you. Like I was saying earlier, because I didn't grow up with The Little Prince or anything, I was reading it, both through just like an adult lens, not like, oh, I read it as a kid, now I'm reading it as an adult, just as an adult lens. And then reading it specifically through the army lens really, kind of made certain things jump out at me because I was, comparing them to the topics in Moon and Map of the Soul. So it's kind of, I come at it from a very specific perspective, and it'll be really interesting to kind of see where the rest of you all land. It's really interesting because I feel like there's a lot of interpretation that can go into The Little Prince, just from like what I was seeing when I was doing research for it, and my perspective and my discussion, because this is a very dense story, even though it's, kind of short and very, childlike and full of wonder. There is so much that can be analyzed from it about life and different symbols, and it's going to be interesting to kind of just be analyzing it through like a BTS lens, because there's so many other things and so many other contexts that you can pull from it. Oh, that's a really good association, a good point to meta loop. It is interesting because I was doing when I was doing different research, one of the things that jumped out, and it actually jumped out at me because I read through it twice, or technically listened to it twice. I was struck by the fact that you have both the snake, which is, if you do biblical stuff, you're almost always going back to the Garden of Eden and the snake. But the other thing that I found really interesting was when the prince meets the fox says, "I'm here under the apple tree," which is like such a very deliberate thing to say. And that jumped out at me too as being like very Garden of Eden-esque. And in my research, I also saw that sometimes people interpret earlier in the story, the prince talks about good seeds and bad seeds, and so like people have talked about how like good and evil is another Garden of Eden thing. So I do feel like you could put a lot of like religious or theological symbolism on top of like a lot of the themes. And the rose is a very interesting one when you look at the idea of like millions of roses, but like, well, a unique rose, and I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah, Hitchhiker Hobbit. I feel like The Little Prince for me was one of those stories that like I really didn't know much about. I just sort of like vaguely knew it was like a story of like a little boy from space who met, with somebody on Earth. Like I feel like that's all I really knew about it. And I think, when I first became an army and I was doing a lot of my original research, and like when Map of the Soul 1 was first shown back in 2020, I feel like everybody, like those visuals were very obviously like everybody was like, oh, The Little Prince. So, I went and I read like a plot summary of it, and was like, okay. But I think sitting down and like really, and it's kind of funny too, because, like just here where I was talking about the astronaut, I think analyzing The Little Prince in 2026 versus analyzing it in 2020 kind of hits different in a way. Like I do think a lot of you almost have to put yourself in the 2020 mindset to fully understand and grasp why The Little Prince fit Jin's work so well at that time. But it is also interesting to analyze it now, having gone through The Astronaut, having, other things that The Little Prince was used in, post 2020, and that's kind of an interesting experience too. So it kind of being able to interface with it at different times is also kind of a different experience. So that's really cool too, and something that I think is really fun about like analyzing books and things when it comes to BTS. Their meaning kind of changes depending on when you're reading them. Okay, so let's talk about symbols and themes. So there's a lot of symbolism and a lot of themes in the book, but like I said, I'm going to focus specifically on the ones that I think are most relevant to talking about BTS and, the relevance to BTS that this book has. And also, of course, the ones that we can see really visually in Jin's performance of Moon. So I've picked the rose, the fox, and the lamp, which, like I said, is, kind of maybe a little bit more of an under the radar symbol, but I think it's really important. So I'll unpack that for sure. I like that, Javine. I like that description. I found myself getting really emotional, both because it's just like, it has a very melancholy ending, but because it made me think about BTS, and like, so that was interesting to kind of see what it was like pinging in me for that. Um, so let's talk about the rose first and foremost, since we kind of already were. So on his planet, the little prince has this rose that he takes care of. And he believes there's like to be the most beautiful and unique thing in the entire universe. But the rose sometimes fail to understand or appreciate his efforts, but she still loves him, and he misses her when he leaves the planet. She says she'll miss him. And when he arrives on Earth, he realizes that other roses exist, and kind of briefly starts to have a crisis of identity a little bit, and like wonders, was his rose really as unique as he thought? But then eventually learns, like I had said earlier, that the love and care that they showed for each other did make their relationship unique and made her unique, and that the special things are what comes from the heart. So I think there's a lot to be said about when looking at the rose as a theme, as Jin uses it in Map of the Soul 1 in that performance. And like I said, I don't think Jin's saying that we're vain or ungrateful or anything, but to me, the sentiment that really jumped out at me with the Little Prince and the Rose is sort of not knowing what you have until it's gone, and having to learn the true depth and meaning of your connection. And so those really jumped out at me, and I think they fit Moon really, really well, because Moon is very much, a song about wanting to connect and, valuing the special connection you have. Javine, yeah, I think that's a really good experience for or I'm sorry, a really good way of explaining it for the Little Prince. I read your comment and I was saying it as I was thinking, but the more you live, yeah, I think the more you can understand. And it's really interesting too, because I imagine that when kids read it, they probably connect to the Little Prince, and then I feel like when you're an adult, you connect to the narrator. The narrator was a really interesting character as well for me reading and thinking about BTS, because the book begins with the narrator talking about how he was discouraged from being an artist and was like sort of pushed in a different path when he was young. And in the story, he says that like he was showing adults his art when he was like 6 years old, and they didn't really understand anything. And it reminded me of the intro for "Oh Are You Late Too," and also Namjoon's speech at the UN, where they say, he's talking about having his heart feel like it stops at age 9 or 10. So it kind of goes back to that idea of like being stopped from actually being your true self, even when you're young. I like that. Don't feed the bears. Yeah, like unique relationships are confusing and hard to understand. You have to, experience and reflect. I love that description, because that's so what the Little Prince is about. He doesn't really understand the value of his connection with the rose until he, leaves and really meditates on it. And yes, that theme of love and connection, in that Ararang idea, of the beloved that you're going away from, you're undertaking a journey, and you'll miss me, and you'll feel the weight of that lost connection when you go on, go away. So Sonia, yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't remember ever seeing like a confirm, and maybe I just, maybe it could even be on like the DVD for Map of the Soul 1, but I don't ever remember specifically hearing like whose idea it was to use the Little Prince. Like I don't know if it's a story that, is I know some of the members have recommended the Little Prince and have talked about enjoying it. So I'm not sure if Jin had also read it and like wanted that to be, how he wanted to frame the song's performance, or if like somebody, like somebody at Big Hit or whatever was like, this would really fit you. I'm not 100% sure on that, but the story really does remind me of Jin, like very much so. And so it definitely wouldn't surprise me if it's something that he read or anything like that. Yeah, I feel like Namjoon did recommend the story previously, if I'm not mistaken. And I know that June also does have some writing credits on Moon. There's very much some lines in Moon that are Namjoon all the way, very much how he thinks. So yeah, I'm not sure if he was bringing that into, the end, was like, hey, you could use Little Prince, because it fits the song so well, and it fits the ideas of the song so well. And I think just the way it's integrated into Jin's stage for Moon is so beautifully done. Like, and it conveys the emotion so perfectly, if you ask me. So we've already been talking about the fox a little bit because, the fox is so kind of important to the story, so it's impossible to really discuss the Little Prince without mentioning the fox. But I think the fox kind of serves as both a character, like the Little Prince and the narrator are characters, but the fox also to me is really symbolic, because of that conversation about taming, about having ties to someone. So and like we said, the idea of having that connection be the thing that elevates your relationship from being, ordinary. You're not an ordinary person to me anymore. You're now special. And the fox teaches the prince that lesson, that the truly precious things in life can only be seen with the heart, not the eyes, and helps him understand his unique love for the rose. So through this, the prince learns uh, another really important lesson that I was really struck by. He learns the lesson that we are responsible for the things we have ties to, and that is something that can make us both very happy and very sad. So I think that's really interesting. No, I didn't mention the reference in Serendipity, but that's a really good one too. I feel like Serendipity has a lot of the same feeling of the Little Prince, of like kind of just that beautiful, um, like fairy tale like, dreamy quality. So it's like, I think Serendipity is another really good song to kind of throw in there as just like having the same themes and a lot of the same beautiful energy. And that's even before Map of the Soul, so you can already kind of see how a lot of those themes were developing and those ideas were developing. They were already thinking about the Little Prince. As always, with BTS stuff, it goes back so much further than just where it first really shows up. Obviously, it's always kind of percolating in the background when they have these references. And I'm just also looking at my notes because I have like 10 pages of notes here. That's another thing too. Talking of the fox, something that really jumped out at me with, kind of like I said, that sort of put me in mind of the astronaut, is the idea of connection making you both happy and sad. And like obviously the astronaut was so melancholy because it was like Jin's final song before he left for the military, which is something we'll get into a little bit later when I get into like some of my thoughts and analysis of the story. But it's like the fox that really makes that lesson really clear. And like obviously the prince feels sad when he leaves the rose, so like we're already kind of introduced to that. But that kind of almost feels a little bit more like regret. Whereas the fox just makes it abundantly clear that legitimately, like when you give yourself over to any type of connection, you will feel, both joy and sorrow. And, that's a really interesting thing to, and like Moon kind of has a little bit of a melancholy quality in its lyrics as well that kind of fit that as well. I wonder if you're looking at me now, will you see my painful wounds? Like there's a little bit of a sadness behind how bright and upbeat Moon is. And it really kind of speaks to, that joy and sadness of connection idea. That's a sweet notion too. Don't feed the bears, and I kind of wondered too. Something that I love about the way connection is framed within this story is I think you can literally look at it as like any type of human connection that you would ever make. And I've definitely thought that in some ways. Having, I don't have children myself, but I kind of the narrator's relationship with the little prince very much felt like it was something that would probably speak to like parents or anybody who is, responsible for a child, because that's another big theme in that idea of being tamed, being connected, is the idea of like now you have a responsibility towards that thing, and I thought like that was definitely something that probably resonates with people as they get older. The idea of being responsible definitely takes on like a whole other idea, a whole other notion. So yeah, Metaloop, good question. So from what I've kind of been able to tell in my analysis, I feel like a lot of what you see for the Little Prince pretty predominantly seems to take place. Where is the there's the one for all of BTS. I think that the most overt references to the Little Prince almost all seem to be in Map of the Soul 7, which makes a lot of sense, because that's where Moon is. So to have it also be like, I can kind of see it in Inner Child, I can kind of see it in On, Microcosmos, Make It Right, seeing a lot of those themes in Map of the Soul and, that era and those albums makes a lot of sense. But I do think you see a little bit of it before Map of the Soul in Love Yourself, and then a little bit after. Like I said, kind of like, Namjoon's song Bicycle was after Mott's, but he was probably still thinking about it a little bit. So it's like it does, and it's interesting because like some of those themes about like wandering the desert and things like that, those have actually been themes that BTS has had even as far back as Wings. They were already like starting to explore that idea of like wandering through the desert. So I think just maybe certain like ideas and things that were part of the Little Prince kind of stuck in their minds when they were doing some of these themes for their videos, themes for their albums. And so even if we don't get super overt references to them, to the Little Prince earlier, I feel like, it was maybe percolating in the background a bit. All right. So the last visual, like overt visual symbol that I want to include here is the idea of the lamp, because as you can see, if you're watching and you're looking at the screen right now, I have a picture from Map of the Soul, the Map of the Soul 1 performance of Moon that Jin did, that shows a lamp as part of his set decoration. And it can be very blink and you'll miss it because it's kind of down below where he's standing. So, and that whole platform is rotating, so it can be very quick to, it took me a while to even find a screenshot of it because it's not something that jumps out right away. But so I mentioned when I was doing the plot summary that the Little Prince goes on a journey and he goes to these other planets. And when he goes to these other planets, he's meeting adults on these planets, most of whom are like just patently ridiculous. Like, for instance, on one of the planets, he meets this very important, very serious businessman who is counting and adding up figures. And when the Little Prince presses him to ask him what he's doing, it turns out that he's counting all the stars because he thinks he owns them, but he doesn't even know what the stars are. Like, and, so all of these adults that the Little Prince meets are supposed to kind of make us think about, like, the follies of certain adult ideas. But one of the people that he meets on one of the planets is a lamplighter who is dedicated to the task of lighting a lamp at night and extinguishing the lamp in the morning. But the planet has started to move so fast that a full day is only like 1 minute long. So he's literally lighting and turning the lamp off every 30 seconds. And that sounds really absurd because he's saying, well, these are my orders. This is what I was, what I'm supposed to do. And that sounds ridiculous because it sounds like you're sort of stuck in like a rigid idea. But what's really, really interesting about the story, and something that really jumped out to me, is that the prince doesn't view the man as ridiculous. He actually admires his dedication to a cause greater than himself. And I really think that's quite interesting. And that really jumped out at me as kind of being really relevant to BTS's message, to Jin's message in Moon, of just like, by showing faithfulness and continuing to do this task, even when it's maybe a little bit hard, kind of that there's a value to that. The Little Prince even says like two things that are very positively portrayed in the story are stars and the sunset. And the little prince really loves this planet because of all the sunsets that it would have. And he also says that the lamp turning on and off is like a star. So I think that's, we're really kind of meant to look at the lamplighter as kind of making like this, very faithful sacrifice to like continually light this lamp. And we're kind of almost supposed to look at it as persistence in the face of trials, and like even though the circumstances have changed, he's still doing this task with faithful dedication. So I just and the fact that the lamp is used in the set decoration for Moon, I think makes it obvious that that's an important part of the message here. So I was really struck by the lamplighter. Javine, I like that description. Yeah, the story begins with the little prince asking for the narrator to draw him a little sheep so he can kind of help prune the plants, but he's worried that it'll eat the rose. And it's like a fun little question that seems really non-important at the beginning of the story. It just seems like this is how we know the little prince is kind of strange, is he just walks up to the narrator in the desert and says, draw me a sheep. But it's so interesting how it like becomes relevant later, and it becomes almost like the central question of the novel. Yeah, I agree, Sonia. Very Jin coded, very BTS coded. It really, really jumped out at me. That the little prince really admires the lamplighter and really like legitimately says as he leaves the planet, of all the people I've met, I could consider him a friend, as he's exploring the galaxy. And I just I was really struck by that, of just the idea of continuing to be faithful and dedicated to the idea, and just found that really moving and poignant to think about. I also I didn't include this in like symbols and themes or anything, but there's a couple of things in The Little Prince that are accidentally so BTS coded that like directly stopped me in my tracks. Like, for instance, the asteroid where the little prince lives is called B612, and like how perfect would that have been if it was B613? But the other thing that jumped out at me is the little prince goes through all these other planets to visit people, and when he is told, hey, you should go to Earth, it means that Earth is the 7th planet that he visits. So it's like we've got 7 in there. So we've got like accidental BTS references in this work from the 1940s. So since we just did symbols, we'll do themes next. I had talked a little bit about the desert already, of course, but I really feel like the desert, I had talked about it more in the BTS context. In the story itself, I feel like the desert represents loneliness and isolation, which is kind of true in BTS's work as well. But, it's especially interesting in the way it's portrayed in The Little Prince. And I also think the fact that the Little Prince and the narrator both survive the desert, maybe, the Little Prince's fate is a little bit more ambiguous, but, they are still able to endure the conditions of the desert. I think it shows that they have like these unique qualities. They have the unique ability to see and do things that no one else really can, kind of like when they, there's this scene where they find the water in the desert. And I think that kind of shows how different they are, and how unique they are. Another thing, of course, that we've been talking about a lot throughout this stream already is the idea of connection being, tamed, that sort of reciprocal taming relationship of, an example of connection. It's an experience that changes not only yourself, but changes the world around you. And there's beauty in having ties to somebody, but also the inherent risk of sorrow. The scene with the fox is one of the scenes that really made me feel emotional, and kind of especially thinking about BTS, when the fox sort of says, like, he asks the little prince to tame him, but then when the little prince makes it very clear that he has no intention of staying, that he wants to continue to move on. But the fox still asks to be tamed and then is sad when the little prince leaves, and the prince is like, why did you have me tame you if you were going to be sad when I left? And he goes, because earlier he says to him, I don't care about the wheat fields, but your hair is the color of wheat, so I'll think the wheat fields are amazing because it'll remind me of you. And so when the little prince says to him, like, why would you subject yourself to such sadness? He goes, because of the color of the wheat. I'll still be able to see the wheat and think of you. And like, the idea of, even though you'll be sad, like the world around you now has different meaning because of a person you're connected to is such an interesting thing. And it definitely reminds me of how the world kind of changes for us, when we love BTS. Even just something as simple as, like, I just point out, like, oh, Seven jumped out at me as BTS, or like how often does like the color purple jump at you, now that you're ARMY, and you think purple and or see a thing and it reminds you of them. And it's true of any type of connection, and I think that's a really special emotional part of the book, and that theme is really beautiful. That idea that you feel both joy and sorrow because of your connections. That's true too of Javine, with the number seven, very often linked to biblical things, and um completeness. That's very much a thing in, like, when you do any type of like theological biblical analysis. Seven is used a lot to symbolize that something is complete, and so that's really interesting too. Of and it's kind of interesting because there's such a theme of loneliness to the little prince, just really baked into the story. The narrator is lonely because people don't understand him. The prince is lonely when he arrives on Earth. Like, there's a lot of talking about how people are kind of small compared to the totality of Earth and the universe. But there's also so much in the story that really emphasizes how beautiful things are, so again, you kind of have that duality of good and bad, joy and sadness, and then kind of beauty and loneliness and obsoleteness. It's really interesting. That's interesting. Don't feed the bears, just like using like acclimated instead of tamed. Yeah, so it was really interesting. I'm not even gonna try and say the French words, but there, like I said earlier, there's apparently two different French words for that could mean tamed, and one, when you look at it, it very obviously kind of means domesticated, like an animal, like you would domesticate, a wild creature, and then the other word is the one that is more predominantly used throughout the text of the Little Prince. And it means having like that reciprocal love and connection. Yeah, having the world remind you of a loved one even when they're not present. Yeah, I agree. That is a very powerful concept, and I think because so many of BTS's songs and albums and things are about different types of connection, you can really feel that same sense throughout other BTS work. Like, Spring Day jumps out at me a lot when we have this conversation, of course, because Spring Day is about lost friendship, so I feel if you look at Spring Day with that same type of mindset of, missing somebody, and, kind of feeling the ache of not having that connection anymore, I feel like that's really relevant to a lot of the same themes of The Little Prince, and just um that idea that there's still like beauty in that connection even though it's lost is really profound. And I think BTS does a really good job of portraying that in a lot of their songs and albums and themes and things. Completedness, forgiveness, and punishment at the same time for like the biblical number seven. I like that, Javine. That's a good way of describing that. And it's I feel like the Little Prince, so much of the story of the Little Prince is about that sort of balance of just, you have both the good and the bad things. It's really interesting. And I think it really highlights that theme in a very subtle way. That balance between things is very much a Wings era theme as well. It's something that's brought up with like Abraxas, for instance. Abraxas is a really big theme throughout Wings because of the novel Damien, and Abraxas was basically like the good and evil balance god, basically. And that's also, of course, very related to like Carl Jung's ideas about certain things. So once again, as I remember saying in our previous book club about The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, a lot of BTS analysis is a closed circle. It all comes back around again, and it all sort of relates to each other, even when it's not intentional. Like, they're just continually drawn to very similar themes and ideas. So obviously, like, they're not doing any type of like Jungian analysis with the Little Prince, because it's not, those two things aren't connected, but their ideas and their themes are so similar that, we can kind of analyze everything in the same way. So the other two themes that we've been discussing throughout as well are, again, that idea of uniqueness, and especially the idea of uniqueness versus commonality. So the idea of being unique because of the connections we have is a huge theme that all the characters learn. And then the unique way that you look at something that you love is also a theme in Moon and the Astronaut. And that kind of takes us right into the core theme of the book, which is what matters in life, which is the idea that things that truly matter can't be seen by the eye. And the story explores all of these types of people who only care about the things that they can count and the things they can quantify, but it challenges us to like not be like that, and so that's really interesting too. I like that description, don't feed the bears. Universality does not cancel out individuality. I like that a lot. And I think that's a very important thing that BTS looks at in their work. That like I'm always amazed whenever any artist, and I think it's something BTS does very well, when any artist can talk about a universal theme but also allow like the individual interpretation of that, because like if we just said, here is a piece of media about love, everybody who encounters that, love is a universal emotion, but everybody has different ideas about what love is, and, who you are expressing love for and how you're expressing it and what it personally means to you. And so it's really quite a special artist who is able to give you something that universal, but then also allow and validate all of your individual interpretations. And talking about the theme of like what matters in life, I was really personally struck when reading the book about how often it's referenced by both the narrator and the Little Prince, and just everything that we see, how often it highlights that adults tend to focus on, like I said, those things that can be counted and quantified, rather than the things that are, like the rich things in life, the things that have true meaning and are truly beautiful. The book talks time and again about how people who have like surrendered themselves to these adult ideas only care about numbers, and that really jumped out at me as kind of like an ineffective way to quantify something. If you're only looking at, like the example that the narrator gives early in the story is that if you say to an adult, oh, I made a new friend, they'll say like, oh, how tall is he? What is his age? How much money does he make? Like things like that. They won't be like, oh, what was he like? Or they'll say, you could say, I saw a beautiful house. And if you start to describe the house, they won't care. It won't register for them. But if you say, oh, I saw a house and it was worth this much amount of money, then they'll go, oh, that house must have been beautiful, And I just thought that was like a really interesting way of kind of describing a lot of the Little Prince as a story is about like the limitations of certain types of thinking, and how, we can be locked into very narrow-minded mindsets. And so a lot of it is kind of challenging us to let go of the things that narrow our thinking, and kind of, like they always are sort of calling it like the adult thinking. We're kind of being challenged to let go of the adult way of thinking and like embrace that more childlike sense of seeing the world. Only the children know what they're looking for. Be like that childlike wonder and have that whimsy and that creativity. And I just thought that was really, really interesting, and it's set up so well in the beginning with the narrator, who feels alone because adults don't understand him, and just that really, really struck me too. Oh my gosh, my computer will not scroll down. There we go. I'm going to jump into some of my analysis and theories. But and we'll of course get to our discussion questions as well. So if you have anything to add for those discussion questions, we have those coming up. But if you had anything else that you wanted to add so far about like any of the symbolism and themes or anything that jumped out at you. Is my microphone okay? I think I might have hit it at one point and maybe lost it a little. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, good. Awesome. I'm like, I don't know what happened there. I think my microphone just like decided to vanish, but it should be okay now. So, Javine, yeah, that's a really good thing. Like, children smile and laugh, but adults don't. And that's something, there's like a little brief interlude where the little prince is talking to a railway switchman, and he's talking about how like adults are on the train and they don't want to be where they are. Like, they're never satisfied where they are. They're just always looking to get to their destination, and only the children are actually like looking outside and like feeling wonder. So like that's a really interesting theme. Again, that kind of reminds me of the astronaut too, of like only the little girl is really like, you know, noticing that there's someone special in her midst. Everybody else is just going about their lives. In a way, it even reminds me a little bit of Running Wild, Jin's song Running Wild, where, you know, Jin is the one who is able to identify, you know, go have the special moments in your life. Don't be afraid, you know? So it's like kind of some interesting stuff there. Okay, good, Hitchhiker Hobbit. Yeah, I think I might have just hit the connection on the microphone, so I'm glad it came back. I don't know what happened there. Oh yeah, don't feed the bears. You're so right that like the prince is searching for the context to explain the blindness he finds among the adults he encounters, you know? And like it's always so interesting every time he encounters one of those other adults on the other planets, he always just leaves the planet and says adults are very strange, like, and it's the people that he meets on the planet are so interesting and symbolic too, because he meets a king with no subjects who only makes orders that can easily be followed. He meets a vain man who thinks he's the best on the planet, but he's the only person on the planet. He meets a drunk man who drinks to forget, but is specifically trying to forget the fact that he is ashamed of drinking. He meets the businessman that I had mentioned who's counting the stars, even though he doesn't even know what they are. He meets our lamplighter that we discussed, and then he meets a geographer who like makes all of these geographies of other places, but doesn't know what his own planet looks like because he doesn't think he is qualified to explore it. He thinks he's only qualified to, you know, write the things down. And it's so interesting to kind of compare all of those ideas to like attitudes that are prevalent in our society. You know, it's really interesting. Thank you, Sonia. Yeah, I was really it really jumped out at me that like even though a lot of what we can analyze for the way Jin interacted and interfaced with this story can kind of stay with Moon. And in 2020, if you imagine his more recent solo work, I do still think you see a lot of those themes and references. Um, and it's really interesting because obviously flying is a huge part of the story, because of, you know, the narrator being a pilot and things like that, and needing to get the plane fixed. But there's also a lot of flying and flight references in Jin's work, to the point where in my translation that I was listening to of The Little Prince, when the narrator is able to fix his plane, the little prince even says to him, "I'm glad that you can fly again." And it reminded me of the opening line of Running Wild, "There's a way that we can fly again," you know? So kind of probably an accidental reference, but it still really works, I think. It's one of those things that's just kind of fun to have jump out at you as an accidental connection. Sonia, I completely agree. Except me, because I still listen to it every day. Hello, AK. It's great to see you. I'm glad you could be here. I hope you have fun listening to the discussion today. It's an interesting story. It's definitely like if you I think the audio version that I listened to was only like 2 hours long or something. And so like if you ever have a little time that you just kind of want to experience the Little Prince and get a feel for it, it's definitely like a quick one to read and really interesting. Definitely, like I've been saying here, it hit me with a lot more emotion than I was expecting, but in a good way. I think it really it was something I'm really glad that I read. Like I feel like it has a lot of value to pull out. So it's like if that's something that you ever feel like you want to do one day, just spend 2 hours listening to The Little Prince. I highly recommend it. Yes, I like that description. That's a good way. It's very layered. Good way to describe it. All right. So I've kind of mentioned most of these things. This is my analysis of the story itself. We've kind of mentioned most of these things already, but I'll still go through it. So I really think that The Little Prince is obviously about life and growing up, but I also think it's very much about how we as people fit into the world around us. Like, what is our responsibility to others? What does it mean to feel love? What things really matter? And why do we let ourselves be caught up in unimportant things just because society assigns value to those things? Why do we let ourselves be swayed by what the novel repeatedly kind of says are like the way that grown-ups think? And then, like I said, that balance, that idea of like good things versus bad things, and how the Little Prince seems to understand the essential ideas behind good and bad far more than adults do. And his ideas are not colored by those societal standards. And I think it's a metaphor for how we cultivate relationships as people, how society deals with people and individuals. And then, of course, because the whole book is about how adults view the world and how children view the world, we're very much, again, looking at the two opposite extremes of adults seeing things logically in black and white, analytically, and then children see the world with wonder and whimsy. And the book really kind of encourages us to see the value in things that you can't actually see and quantify. It's very much about how important it is to see things with your heart, not your mind, seeing what's truly important, not what is only perceived as important. It's very much, I believe, a challenge to sort of update our values so that we're not only assigning value and importance to the things that society says matter. Or those very, like, the narrator always says, like, the boring adult things, like, let me just talk about the boring adult things because this person doesn't understand. So the book is very much like saying, hey, don't just go with what everybody tells you is important. Figure out what's important to you. And I think that's really special. Yes, feelings versus what adults value is such a good description. Don't feed the bears. Kind of like I was saying before with, when the narrator talks about, you know, adults only want to know basically like the superficial, quantities of things, like how old is that person or how tall are they, not who are they as a person, and that's very much I think kind of a almost like a critique of a societal attitude too. Logic isn't logical. I love that. And it is very true that a lot of, and that's a huge theme in a lot of BTS's work as well. It's something that I think you see a lot too in Namjoon and Yoongi's work, where they kind of say this is the attitude that is trying to be said is logical, but it's not actually logical. It's kind of just, I always think of the song Strange off of Yoongi's mixtape D2 that both he and Namjoon did together. And that's very much like the theme. I know that's kind of a weird connection, but it always jumps out at me as being a good song to discuss when you're discussing, like, looking at common societal attitudes and then, like, looking at how strange they are, because that's literally what the song is about and why it's called Strange, because it literally is saying, hey, you've decided that this is just the way society operates, and you've tricked yourself into thinking that this is normal, and you're not actually stopping to look at how strange these things are in society and how unlogical these attitudes are. And you know, I always think that's really interesting. All right, so I'm going to jump down into my theories specifically about, I think, one of the biggest questions that can be asked when we analyze The Little Prince from the army lens, from the BTS lens, is the notion of why The Little Prince and why Moon. You know, like, why was The Little Prince chosen specifically for Moon and not another song? Why was The Little Prince the thing that they decided to build Moon around? Like, I mean, there's a lot of questions of, like, why these two songs are given such a heavy relationship. And so that's what I wanted to kind of put into my thoughts and theories here. And I think a lot of that question, at least from my perspective, can be answered when you consider the fact that Moon was likely going to be Jin's last solo song before military service. I think it really brings the themes of The Little Prince and Moon together. So obviously, at the time Map of the Soul 7 was released, BTS had not yet received the extension that they got, you know, the extension that allowed them to postpone for 2 additional years. So they thought 2020 would be when Jin was going into the military. And so obviously he could have done like an individual solo song, much like the astronaut. You know, he could have done something else in 2020 if he had to go in. But otherwise, Moon would have been his last solo song, you know, and it definitely would have been his last solo song on a BTS album. So, keeping that in mind, I think many of the themes of The Little Prince make all the more sense. So, the themes of being responsible for another person, and acknowledging that the bonds that you have may make you sad or make them sad, especially when you have to leave, it all fits so much when you think about Jin conveying that message to Army before he thought he had to go in the military. The Rose kind of also says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of myself," which is very much, I feel like, Army would be trying to say, "Don't worry about us, we'll be okay." And then, as I've been discussing throughout the live stream, I think that we see part of why we see so many of the Little Prince themes in The Astronaut is because then that was Jin's last solo song before he went into the military. So, you know, The Astronaut centering on the lonely explorer who finds the friend and comes to understand, like, the truly precious things in life. You know, there's a lot of plot points in The Little Prince that are almost referenced, like, directly in The Astronaut, and I think it makes a lot of sense if you think that just that was the message that Jin wanted to convey before he went to the military, starting first with Moon and then with the astronaut. Yeah, exactly, Sonia. You know, it's because Moon always seems like such a bright, upbeat song when you just listen to it, you know, because it has just such a beautiful vibe and energy and sort of special, you know, quality. But when you actually read the lyrics, there's like a really deep sadness there, and a lot of the lyrics are very emotional. And when you consider that, yeah, that was going to be Jin's, you know, most likely be Jin's last sort of message to Army before he went in the military. I really think a lot of things kind of click into place for it. So if you put yourself in that 2020 mentality, I definitely think Moon and the Little Prince being meshed together, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm so curious to hear. I mean, we've been talking about it kind of sprinkled throughout the live stream of just like why the themes of The Little Prince really remind us of BTS and why it fits. But I'm curious if there's anything else that, you know, to answer that question of why the Little Prince was used so visually in Moon. If you all had any other thoughts too, I'd love to hear them, but that's the one that really jumps out to me, is it really discusses the military service element of it in a way without obviously having to overtly discuss it. I think it's very relevant. The other thing too with the astronaut, I was really struck with really struck by the fact in the Little Prince that he says to the narrator, and it's so interesting because the way that it's originally described that he's coming to Earth it just sounds like he just like arrives there, but later when he's talking to the narrator, he says, "Oh, it was a year since I fell to Earth," which very much feels like the plot of The Astronaut, where he lands on Earth, kind of crash lands on Earth, and then has to wait for an extended period of time before he can go back. So it's like that really reminded me of The Astronaut too. Yeah, Javine, that's something that has always struck me about BTS's music, and something that I think is so special. And it's part of the reason why I don't like other music. I just like BTS, because once I personally, other than like a few things that I make exception for them, like, okay, I can listen to that. For me, I feel like once you realize how deep and meaningful and personal and, introspective music can be, it's hard to go back to listening to music that's not about anything. you know um and I think that some of that beauty comes from the fact that, that's a very specific thing that Jin was going through. Jin was talking about his feelings and was probably putting a lot of his feelings about, leaving to go to the military into this song and these performances. But, Moon can still really speak to you, and the ideas of Moon can still really speak to you, even if you don't have any of that, going on in your own life. I always think of the line from Moon of like, if, saying, "If you look at me, will you see all of my painful wounds?" I think about that a lot, and I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, even though all of the things that we all individually struggle with are different. We can all sort of relate to that idea of like, don't look at me too closely, or you'll start to see the parts of myself that I don't want other people to see. And I just think that's a really interesting thought, as of just, it's also something that they talk about in the song Respect, which is right after, either before or after Moon, I forget now, but it was kind of twinned with Moon on the album, where they say like, will the weaker version of me be revealed the more you look at me? Because in Respect they kind of look at it as if you are re-inspecting something. So kind of an interesting idea that's traced throughout Map of the Soul. Loneliness, connection, meaning, and choices. Yeah, those are all like so central to The Little Prince, and to, I think, a lot of Jin's solo work pre-military, both Moon and The Astronaut. And just loneliness is a really interesting theme, that I find I'm always kind of drawn to when BTS talk about it or other things, because loneliness, I think people mistake loneliness for sometimes being like, oh, you don't have like a specific person, and it's not always that. It's a lot of times just like the feeling of kind of like yearning and things like that. I saw a quote once, and I don't know, you see things online and you're like, is that actually? So I don't know if Carl Jung actually said this, but if he did, I think it's so perfect, and it's just yet another way that Carl Jung and like, BTS's work really match up. And the quote is, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And that is very much central to the idea of The Little Prince, and it's what the narrator discusses right off the bat, of like having nobody understand the way he sees the world, and having nobody that he can talk to. And he literally says, "I lived all alone," and I don't even think that means in the sense of not having people, because later the narrator talks about having friends and that his friends are relieved when he is able to leave the desert and come back home. So he has people in his life who care about him, but he doesn't have a lot of people who understand him. And I think that's really interesting too, because it kind of gives us that idea of what does loneliness actually look like. And it doesn't necessarily, he should be lonely in the desert, but it's in the desert that he finds the person who actually connects to him the most, as opposed to, back home in quote unquote civilization. So after this, the next slide that I have is going to be different quotes that jumped out at me. This section is called important quotes. I don't necessarily know if all of these are important, but a lot of them are ones that just jumped out at me. And I do have a lot of quotes in this section. If you remember last book club with the ones who walked away from Omelas, I think I only had like 3 or 4 because it was such a short story. But here I have a lot more. Exactly, Javine. Yeah, and I think a lot of people tend to think that that's what loneliness is, and that's not the, it's the case for some people, of course, but it's definitely not the universally applicable way of like discussing actual loneliness. It's like loneliness is definitely like Don't Feed the Bears are saying, it's a feeling, and it's something. In some ways it's even like a state of being where you're like, you feel lonely because you're misunderstood, and like it's not necessarily, you can still feel lonely in a crowd of people or amongst your friends or anything like that. And it's just like, I always think of loneliness as being like a more deep emotion than just, I'm lonely, let me go see a person and now I am no longer lonely. I always think of it as more being like a yearning for understanding. Or even in some cases, like you just said, Sonia, like BTS is good at expressing loneliness and yearning in their songs. And I think a lot of times they're yearning for things that are intangible, which goes back perfectly to the theme of The Little Prince. A lot of times it's like, I'm yearning for a better world. I'm yearning for understanding. I'm yearning for self-love. It's like a lot of other things that are intangible and are not so easily solved, and that's really interesting to me, that loneliness tends to be a deeper thing. It's not something that's going to be, easily corrected by just like going and meeting people and things like that. And it's a deeper thing. It's like a deeper ache that's harder to get rid of. All right, so lots of quotes today for The Little Prince, but like I said, maybe not all of these are necessarily important, but I thought some of them were interesting. They had interesting things that I think we've already kind of been discussing throughout the stream today, but let me see if any of these kind of jump out at all of you as well. So the first 2 quotes I have are both from chapter 4, and they talk about like that idea of adults only caring about numbers and things. So both of these are from the narrator. The first one is, those of us who understand life couldn't care less about numbers. And the other one is when he's talking about, because the story actually takes place 6 years after the narrator and the Little Prince met. It's 6 years later that he's telling this story, and he's saying he's doing all this because he doesn't want to forget the Little Prince. So he says, it's sad to forget a friend. Not everyone has had a friend, and I might become like the grown-ups who are no longer interested in anything but numbers. And that's something that I think is really interesting about the theme of the story as well. As I was, while I was doing research, I found some things by the author where the author was talking about, like, in essays that he wrote or letters that he wrote to people, or other works that he wrote, like his biography and things like that, where he was, a lot of it seemed to be him like basically lamenting the fact that the faster the world starts to move, the more we lose the ability to connect with each other. And like a lot of it is him basically saying, like, we have forsaken the ability to connect with people. And I think that's really interesting in that quote that I just read of almost acknowledging that like adult life makes it difficult to actually connect with people on a human level, because you're becoming interested in more of those quantity numerical things. You're not looking quite so much as at the important things. So that those quotes really jumped out at me. And then in chapter 9, we have something that the rose says to the little prince before he leaves, because he would always kind of protect her and put like a screen and a cover over her so she wasn't affected by the elements, including like the bugs and things. And, he would get rid of the caterpillars for her and stuff. So, he says, but I won't be here to do that. And she says to him, I need to put up with the caterpillars if I want to get to know the butterflies, which I think is a really interesting one. And we know butterflies are also kind of used symbolically in some of BTS's work. And so that's in chapter 9. And then chapter 14 is the quote about the lamplighter, as we were mentioning the lamp as a theme before. And this is what the little prince thinks about the lamplighter. He says, the lamplighter would be despised by all the others, meaning all the other people on the other planets that he visits. Yet he's the only one who doesn't strike me as ridiculous. Perhaps it's because he's thinking of something besides himself, which is what I mentioned when talking before about the street lamp, as a symbol of just like responsibility and duty, and continuing to do that task and be responsible for that task despite the change in circumstances. And then this quote I just thought was pretty. From chapter 17, the little prince says, I wonder if the stars are lit up so each of us can find our own someday, which I really reminded me of Microcosmos, so I had to include that one. Circling back to our theme of talking about loneliness, also in chapter 17, when the prince first meets the snake, when he lands in, so obviously he lands in the desert, there's no people there, so he's kind of confused. He thinks that there's like nobody on Earth, because he's in the desert. So he says to the snake, where are the people? It's a little lonely in the desert. And the snake replies, it's lonely when you're among people too. So that goes back to that conversation we were just having about loneliness, of just like being among people, you can feel lonely if you feel misunderstood. And that of course also goes back to the narrator's point of having lived his life without anybody to understand him. Chapter 21 is where we get the fox's quintessential lesson that is the theme of the book. And the fox says to the little prince, here's my secret. It's quite simple. One sees clearly only with the heart. Anything essential is invisible to the eyes. And so that's very much the theme of the whole book. Then in chapter 24 is that mention of the well that I was talking about, where we have like the contrast of the desert and then, a source of water. So in chapter 24, the little prince says, what makes the desert beautiful is that somewhere it hides a well. So very much a desert versus water theme, like BTS does a lot with the ocean and the desert. And then I found, so this other quote in chapter 24 from the narrator really struck me when we're talking about, like, it reminded me thinking about Moon and like the astronaut and, those themes of dedication to somebody even though you have to leave and things like that. So the narrator observes the little prince while they're in the desert. They're looking for the water and the little prince falls asleep, so he's carrying him. And this is the narrator's thoughts as he's carrying him through the desert night is, what moves me so deeply about this sleeping little prince is his loyalty to a flower, the image of a rose shining within him like the flame within a lamp. Lamps must be protected. A gust of wind can blow them out. And so there's a beautiful symbolism there of like also keeping the light alive in somebody, but also like the lamp that we mentioned, of just, how the lamplighter was viewed as being so loyal. And so it's really interesting that then like the little prince is likened to a rose. So I think that's really interesting too. Oh, Hitchhiker Hobbit, that sounds really interesting. Also, no worries about watching the two different streams. No worries at all, but yeah, I'd be interested to hear that quote. Don't Feed the Bears. I like both of your comments of like the dedication to altruistic endeavors and like putting that light on what's important, and also like the truth hidden in emptiness for the desert, is really fascinating. And something that I find really interesting too about the scene where they find the well in the desert is like the story kind of goes out of its way to say like this well should not be here. They're like, this is like the well that you would have in a village, but there's no village. There's nobody around for like hundreds of miles. And so it's really interesting that the story basically says this should not be here. Like, and I really like that. It's just like that brief little interlude. And there's a really nice scene, a really meaningful scene too, where they pull the water out of the well to drink, and it's made. They comment on how much sweeter it is to have the water because they had to find it and work for it, and they really, really needed it, you know. And so like that makes it so much better and so much more nourishing because it's something that they really required. Oh, Hitchhiker Hobbit. I'm gonna read that out. So this is a quote from a YouTube video from an army who went to a concert alone. I had one ticket. I came completely alone, and I have never felt less alone in my entire life. I love that, and that's very much how I felt when I went to see the boys for PTTLA alone. You know, it was all by myself going to do it, and it's just like I never at any point felt like I was truly alone. You know, and that's a really powerful emotion. I love that. That is so beautiful. And that kind of takes us to, you know, going back to that realm of like BTS symbolism of the story You Never Walk Alone. And you know, in our last book club we talked about the ones who walk away from Omelas and how specifically in that story it's described that the people who leave the city of Omelas leave alone. It's described like 3 or 4 times they leave alone. But when you look at how BTS chooses to portray that idea, they're not alone. They're together in the video. It's part of an album called You Never Walk Alone. You know, it's very much that idea of connection. So the last two quotes that I have here on the quote slide, one is the narrator talking in chapter 25. He says, "You risk tears if you let yourself be tamed." And he's thinking about how he'll feel when the little prince leaves, you know, and again, that goes back to that idea of, you know, there's joy in connection, but there's also sadness, which very much colors the last few chapters of the book as the narrator reflects on how sad it is to no longer have the little prince around, but also like how, you know, beautiful that connection was. And then in the final chapter of the story, these are the last lines of the book, when the narrator is saying, you know, hey, if you see him, let me know. He says, "If this should happen, be kind. Don't let me go on being so sad. Send word immediately that he's come back." And again, when you think of Moon and the astronaut and BTS having to go off to military service and, you know, how we all waited for them, it really reminds me of that, of just send word that they're back, you know. And yes, I cried. I admit it. Oh, don't feed the bears. Wow. Yeah. That is that's an interesting example of the exact reverse, you know, where it's like there are people around you but they don't understand what you're going through. They can't possibly feel the same emotion, so you feel alone, you know, even though there are people around you. And I think that's such a like a universal human experience that we all go through, of just like, hey, there are people but they don't understand me, they don't understand what I'm going through, you know. And the loneliness that we feel and the isolation that we feel, you know, it's an interesting part of the human experience. Yeah, Sonia, me too. That definitely, and even before I was really familiar with The Little Prince, you know, and I just kind of like knew of it vaguely, I actually had seen that quote, and it definitely made me think of the military hiatus, of, you know, just like, you know, being sad and waiting for them, and just like, you know, there's the last part of the book is so beautifully described. Like the narrator shows a picture of the desert and says, "This is like the saddest and most beautiful place in the world," you know. And again, that idea of like it's both desolate but beautiful. It contains good memories and sad memories, and it's just such a melancholy ending, but such a beautiful ending to the book. And when you analyze it from that army lens, it really takes on this extra feeling. And the ending of the book, kind of, what I think is really interesting is, as a reader, the mystery is what happened to the prince, because the snake bites him, but there's no body. So it's like, what happened to him? But within the story, the mystery to the narrator is not the idea of whether the prince got home or not. To the narrator, the mystery is, did the sheep eat the rose? And so, like, I think that's really interesting that he is saying, oh, it's a mystery, but the story is actually, like, almost giving you a different mystery than the one that you actually have, if that makes sense. Oh, Javine. Oh, wow. What a moment. What a moment of connection. And, like, so unexpected to, be so far away from, where you started your journey, and like, then, but still meeting somebody who understands that journey. That's so profound. I hope that everything that, anybody, both you and your family and anybody else who might be listening who does have, family or friends in Venezuela, I hope everybody is all right. That's insane what's been happening there. And yeah, it's a lot of natural disasters happened within a really short period of time the other day. So, I'm wishing everybody well and wishing everybody safety, because that was terrifying to hear about. So, my discussion questions might be a little bit superfluous, because I think we've kind of been like answering these questions as we went, throughout the live stream in general. But I'll still put them up in case you guys had any thoughts as we were going through, or anything you didn't get a chance to say. But so for my discussion questions, I have, what parts of The Little Prince do you think speak to BTS and their message? Like I said, we've been talking about that a lot. I also have, what central life lessons do you believe the book teaches, and what part of its message stood out to you? And then my last question is, how do you think the story wants us to view the Little Prince? Are we supposed to interpret him as real or merely a symbol? Kind of like I said just now, the way the narrator describes the mystery of the Little Prince, is very different than how we as a reader would look at it. Like, so I'm kind of curious, as you were reading, did you just sort of look at it and think this is just like kind of a fairy tale-esque story? Of course the Little Prince is real. We're just supposed to accept that at face value. Or do you think there's like a deeper symbolism to the Little Prince's existence? I'm curious what you all might think about those. For me personally, like I've been talking about throughout the live stream, I definitely think that, in terms of like what parts of the Little Prince do you think speak to BTS and their message, dreams, creativity, youth, the stars, being different and going against societal expectations, friendship, loneliness, becoming an adult, and like the bonds of love and responsibility and duty, all of that is BTS to me. That is like quintessentially BTS. In some ways, I almost feel like all of BTS's story is contained within those elements. I feel like you could almost look at BTS's story from beginning to now through like The Little Prince, and it's all right there. So, um and then, kind of the lessons that jumped out to me are very much the same, of just like connection is vital, love is responsibility, imagination and going beyond what's visible or logical, the loneliness of being misunderstood, and of course ultimately that love is painful but worth it. So that those all jumped out at me. And then So I'm seeing you guys for question three. You're thinking that it's a little bit of it could be both. I'm seeing Javine says symbolic. Don't Feed the Bear says both. Um, I think so. I kind of feel the same way as Don't Feed the Bears of saying like both. Like I feel like you can absolutely just read the story and go, well, it's just like a fairy tale, sort of fantasy, fable, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, of course it has some sort of magical, supernatural elements. We're just supposed to accept that, that's what it is. But I also kind of look at the Little Prince and I immediately felt like you could view the Little Prince as like the inner that like childlike curiosity and like for me, I feel like you could look at the Little Prince and think of him as your own inner child, because the narrator talks about how misunderstood he felt ever since he was young. And it's like, here's the Little Prince who understands him. And I just feel like you could look at that and say, that's your inner child for sure. And that even goes back to Map of the Soul 7 and V's song Inner Child. And so I think there could be an interesting element of that. Like, in a way, maybe we all have our own version of the Little Prince, just like we all have those, ideals in us. Yeah, I definitely feel like it could be open to interpretation. And probably I feel like you could read the story multiple times throughout your life and come to different conclusions each time, and be like, oh yeah, he's just definitely supposed to be like a real character in this fantasy story. And then in another sense, you can be like, nope, he's just like the narrator's inner child or something. It's really interesting. It's a story that I definitely think I'll enjoy coming back to over the years and reading it with different ideas and different contexts in mind. It's so beautifully told and like it's so whimsical but also so sad. Like I mean it's just like it really was, such an emotional roller coaster. I enjoyed it so much and enjoyed getting to analyze it and think about it. I'd love to. I was listening to an audiobook copy, so I'd love to get a physical copy of it because it's just like it just struck me as so beautiful. Yeah, exactly, Javine. We all have an inner child. There's always and like something that I always find really interesting to see people talk about is like as you get older and like certain hobbies that you leave behind or certain passions that you leave behind and like how much it heals people to get in touch with those parts of themselves that they otherwise had left behind as they got older. And I just the narrator even does it in the story. He says like he doesn't want to kind of lose his sense of self and lose the sort of whimsy that the Little Prince gave him, and he wants to, he said, oh, I went out and I bought drawing materials and like so that was something that he had been dissuaded from, when he was younger, but the Little Prince encourages him to get back into it, and he does so, and like that's the first thing the Little Prince says to him is, please draw me a sheep, and it's just, it's so interesting that that is basically the narrator's whole journey of just like getting back to the parts of himself that he lost. He also talks a lot, especially later in the story, about his own childhood, and he compares things to his own childhood. Like he talks about when they're looking for the well in the desert, he says it reminds him of a house where he grew up where they said, ooh, there's a treasure buried somewhere. And he goes, I don't even know if that was true, but the fact that we thought about it, that, ooh, the house has a secret, made it special. And he also talks about when they draw the water out of the well, he says it reminds him of like getting a Christmas present, how it's like he didn't just get a Christmas present and that was that. It was like the whole meaning of everything that was going around, like the whole season and people, being kind to each other and the spirit of generosity and like all of that added to the Christmas present. So he kind of, as the story goes on, he gets more in touch with like probably those old memories that he hadn't thought about as much, and it all comes back to him. Wow, that's a really good description. Don't feed the bears. Like holding on to like the child part of yourself is almost too difficult and painful, but like if you let it go, it like kind of destroys and creates. It's really fascinating. I think that that's probably going to be a universal human experience for all time of just like the challenges of, growing and changing and things like that. Yep, destroying the egg, which takes us right back to Abraxas and Wings and Carl Jung. Hey, Sweet Style, good to see you. Thanks for being here today. Yeah, I feel like that's the question that I had too before I started reading the story. Just because like I had read a plot summary, like I had said previously, I read a plot summary back around when I was like first army and doing research and stuff, and because I became an army in early 2020, and then like Map of the Soul 1 was late 2020, so I was still pretty new to stuff. And I just remember reading a plot summary and being like, ooh, okay, that seems like maybe he wasn't a real character. But when you read the story just treats him like he's real, So it's kind of interesting and very up to individual interpretation. But yeah, it does kind of in a way almost feel like the narrator's self therapy, like because literally why would the little prince ask him to draw, like things like that, but it's like drawing is kind of like this secret thing that he never got to do, so it's really really fascinating. It's such an interesting story, and like there's so much that I didn't even get into analysis wise of the little prince, because like I had said at the beginning of the stream, I wanted to keep it just focused on the BTS elements, but there's a lot of elements that people who analyze the story bring into it, even from the author's personal life and like the context around when it was written, because he wrote it during World War II, so like there's whole other interpretations that are outside of like our interpretations as army that are also really interesting. So, believe it or not, we have been on stream for almost 2 hours. Like, I can't believe how fast the time went for this. That's everything that I have written down, and like slide wise for the story. But is there anything that I missed that you all have been thinking about that you want me to touch base on? Anything that jumped out at you while we were talking about it, or for those of you who read the story, anything that jumped out at you while you were reading? Anything else that we want to discuss? Oh, you're so welcome, Sonia. I'm so glad. I was really, really excited to talk about this with everybody, and this was kind of a group pick. When we talked about it in previous book club, we all kind of arrived here. So thank you all for like suggesting it and being open to doing this one next. I had so much fun with this. Oh, Javine, I love that. Even if the little prince is symbolic and represents emotions, emotions are real, so he's real. I love that description. Yeah, even if the little prince is like just a part of ourselves, that's still real, It's such a fascinating way of looking at it. I reading this book, I definitely could see why it is so beloved and why it's been translated into so many languages and is still so relevant, nowadays. It really speaks to such important universal themes. It's such an interesting novel. Don't feed the bears. Yeah, I feel that. And for those of you who are on Discord, we do also have, a space where that's open to talk about the Little Prince as well. So, if anything jumps out at you after the fact, or like maybe if you haven't read it yet and you do end up reading it and you have any thoughts, feel free to discuss them there. For those of you who just, are just on YouTube with us, feel free to leave any comments that may come to you, after the stream, like, just when the video's up on the channel, if anything jumps out at you. I love seeing comments after the fact, too. So, So, great question, Sonia. So, I wanted to ask you all what you thought of that. So, um, we have done two kind of shorter ones with The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas and then The Little Prince. So, then the big question is, what do we want to do next? So, we could, if you wanted to just do, like, I don't want to say simple because it's not simple, but, if you wanted to do something that we could maybe like do a little bit more quickly, we could do Map of the Soul, The World of Persona, Shadow, and Ego in the World of BTS, which is written by a Jungian scholar discussing Map of the Soul 7 and just like Map of the Soul in general. And then we could jump into Damien, which we would do in chunks. We wouldn't do the whole book at once. We'd do it chapter by chapter. Don't Feed the Bear says Magic Shop. We could definitely do Magic Shop. Oh, Javine, you're so welcome. I'm glad. It sounds like a nice way to spend the day. Book club and riding the bike, even though it is very hot right now. And I think everybody's experiencing that. I'm here in Florida and the real field temperatures have been like 110. I'm like, I don't want to go outside when it's 110. Like, I'm going to be inside. Thank you. So I'm gonna pull up Audible and take a quick look at some like lengths of books and things. Let's see. Where's my list of BTS related books on Audible? Let's see. So, I just going strictly on the audiobook length, Into the Magic Shop is like 7 hours, so that's not going to be too long. And then Map of the Soul 7, Persona, Shadow, and Ego in the World of BTS is like 4 hours long, so that one's pretty short. Okay, so I'm seeing the Map of the Soul book and then Magic Shop, Into the Magic Shop. So, interesting. Okay, cool. Yeah, Hitchhiker Hobbit. I know both Into the Magic Shop and Map of the Soul are both available on Audible. I have both of them. I've listened to the Map of the Soul book previously because I use it for research, but I haven't listened to Into the Magic Shop yet. So, do we want to do like Map of the Soul first and then Into the Magic Shop and like have those be, those would probably be our last two books for 2026, just thinking about schedule, because like with the concerts coming up and like my own concert in August, I figure I could see these being like September and October, or like September and November, just like depending on how schedules work out. So then we would probably be saving anything a little bit longer, like Damien or anything, until like 2027. So like, how does that sound? I can also always put it on like a poll on the YouTube channel and we can vote on which book we'd rather do. That works too. I'm okay with that. Awesome. Okay, so I think that's what we'll do. We'll do Map of the Soul, The World of Persona, Shadow, and Ego in the World of BTS next. And let me get you guys author names so you can look up those books. That one is done by Murray Stein. And then, so that'll be our next one. And then, whoops. After that, we'll do Into the Magic Shop, which is by James Doty, Doty. And I'll get you guys dates and stuff on those, of course. Pretty much once I get to the other side of my concert, then I'll be able to think a little bit more in depth about like when we want to do what, because I that's obviously a big focus. And then I know, like, for those of you in Europe who are concert going, a lot of you have concerts coming up, so like I don't want to overwhelm anybody with also trying to do like book club in the midst of your concert preps and things like that. So I'll definitely let you know when those are coming, probably in September for the first of those. So And that kind of works too, because in a way we're moving up in terms of like how long these stories have been. Started off with The Ones Who Walk Away from Momolas, which is only a couple pages, jumped into The Little Prince as a novella, and then we'll do slightly longer, slightly longer. We're working through it together. All right, so that's about everything that I have for you today. If you had any other final thoughts, either about The Little Prince or about book club in general, anything else, channel related that you had any other thoughts about, please let me know. Um, for those of you who maybe came in a little bit later, I did want to let you know I have to postpone my next live stream. I was going to have it be July 19th. It's now going to be a new date, but I'm not 100% sure on that yet. But I will keep you guys posted. And I want that next live stream to just be a fun, casual chatting stream where we can talk concert stuff, since I know, like I said, a lot of you will have seen the concerts by that point. So 8 and 9 days for you, Hitchhiker Hobbit. You are so close. Oh, I'm so excited for you all. I can't wait to hear about all of your concert experiences and stuff. Tampa feels like it was a while ago. Like, so, I kind of am anxious to hear what you all think about the concerts. You're so welcome, Don't Feed the Bears. Thank you for being here and all of your amazing insights today. Yay, I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you all are really enjoying book club. I'm having a blast with it, so I'm so happy that you guys are enjoying it as much as I am. And if you, as always, if you have any other suggestions about book club, please let me know. We still have like a lot of different stuff that we can add and do to book club to make it better if anything needs any bugs worked out. So, Hitchhiker Hobbit, I will cross all of my fingers for you, manifesting spring day, and so what for you. Here's hoping. But yeah, I'm really excited to hear what you guys get. I'm just excited to hear about your experiences in general. Like, I can't wait to talk to you guys about your experiences. And like I said, I'll keep you posted on when that next date will be. Great. I'm so glad that you love the dynamic of everything. It's really, really fun. I'm really enjoying being able to, you know, choose the books with you guys and then just like have like these really fun discussions. It's so enjoyable to be able to analyze these books both as they are, just on their own merit, and then like also analyze their connections to BTS. It's really, really cool. Right, Hitchhiker Hobbit, I know you. I know you. I know the love for So What. But yes, that is my wish for all of you. May you all get the surprise song of your dreams, that, the one that you've been longing to hear. I hope it happens. And it's really nice too, because even for those of us who won't be at your concerts, we'll see pictures and clips and things, and so we can kind of be connected to your experience. So alrighty, everybody. So I'll go ahead and start wrapping things up. Thank you again, as always, for all of your amazing insights. Thank you for coming here and supporting the stream and hanging out with me, spending your Sunday with me. I really appreciate it. If you missed anything, it'll be up on the channel for later, and I'll keep you updated with all of my future dates and plans and things for streams, and I'll keep you posted on when the next one will be, and I'll keep you posted on when we do the next book club. So have a great rest of your day, everybody. And I hope to talk to you again very soon. For those of you who are concert going throughout July, have fun, be safe, hydrate, all of that. Have the best time ever. And I can't wait to hear all about it. So good luck to all of you as you go through concert mode. And if you're on Discord and you feel comfortable sharing pictures, feel free to share pictures, any of that stuff. Oh, they should definitely, yeah, Young Forever for the London concerts, I feel like is essential. So I hope that happens. That would be so beautiful. You're welcome, AK. Thanks for being here. It was good to see you. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a good rest of your week. You're welcome, Javine. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Congrats again on the concert. I hope you had a lot of fun, and thank you for being here, even though, you've had a busy weekend, busy Friday, Saturday. But I will see you all again very, very soon. Thank you all so much. Bye, T Style. All right. Talk to you all soon. Bye bye.